The day my divorce became official, I thought I had lost everything. My marriage was over, my family was falling apart, and I believed my future was ruined. But minutes after leaving the courthouse, I made one phone call to my father that changed everything. I whispered, "Dad, it's time. Remove all 27 employees my mother-in-law secretly placed inside your company." He went silent. Because for years, those people had been slowly taking control of the business my father built from nothing. And that same evening, my mother-in-law arrived at my house demanding answers. My name is Emily Carter, and I'm 29 years old. For most of my life, I believed loyalty and family were the two things that could never be broken. I grew up watching my father build Carter Industries from a tiny office with 3 employees into a company that provided jobs for hundreds of people. I watched him work late nights, sacrifice vacations, and risk everything just to create something our family could be proud of. To me, that company wasn't just a business. It was my father's life story. When I married Daniel, I thought I had found someone who understood that. He always told me how much he admired my father and how lucky he felt to be part of our family. At first, he was supportive, caring, and exactly the kind of husband I thought I would spend my life with. Then there was his mother, Victoria. When I first met my mother-in-law, she was charming. She knew exactly what to say and always made people feel important. She told my father that she admired what he had built and that she wanted to help him prepare the company for the future. My father trusted people easily. He believed that when someone offered help, they usually meant well. That was how Victoria slowly entered the company. She started with small suggestions. She recommended new strategies, introduced experienced professionals, and convinced my father that bringing in fresh talent would make the company stronger. At first, everything seemed normal. A new manager would appear here. A new consultant would join there. Victoria always had an explanation. "They're incredibly talented," she would say. "They have connections that can help the company grow." Nobody questioned it. Not even me. Because I was focused on my marriage. I was trying to build a future with Daniel, and I wanted to believe his family cared about mine. But looking back now, I realized the warning signs were everywhere. The strange part was that almost every person Victoria brought into the company seemed to know her personally. They defended her ideas. They supported every decision she made. And slowly, people who had worked with my father for years started disappearing. At the time, I convinced myself it was just business. I had no idea that my mother-in-law wasn't helping my father's company. She was quietly building control over it. The first sign that something was wrong wasn't the employees. It was Daniel. The man who once supported me started changing little by little. He stopped asking about my day. He became defensive whenever I mentioned his mother's involvement in my father's company. Whenever I questioned why so many new people were being hired, Daniel always had the same answer. "Emily, my mom knows what she's doing. You need to stop assuming the worst." But deep down, I felt something was wrong. It wasn't just about Victoria anymore. It was about the fact that my own husband seemed more loyal to her than to me. Our arguments became more frequent. Daniel said I was being disrespectful toward his family. I told him I was protecting something my father had spent decades building. Eventually, the conversations became colder. Then one evening, Daniel looked at me and said something I never expected to hear. "Maybe we should accept that this marriage isn't working anymore." I remember sitting there, completely frozen. After years together, after all the promises we made, he was ready to walk away. The divorce process was painful, but what hurt the most was how quickly Daniel seemed to move on. He acted like our marriage was just another problem he needed to solve. He blamed me for everything. He said I was too focused on my father's company. He said I didn't respect his family. He made it seem like I was the reason everything fell apart. And for a while, I believed him. Then, on the day my divorce was finalized, everything changed. I was cleaning out some old files when I found a folder that had accidentally been sent to me. Inside were employee records, hiring documents, and internal reports from my father's company. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at. Then I saw the names. One after another. 27 employees. And beside several of their names were connections I recognized. Friends of Victoria. Former colleagues of Victoria. People she had personally recommended. My hands started shaking as I looked through the documents. These weren't random hires. They had been carefully placed in different departments over several years. Human resources, finance, operations, management. Victoria wasn't just suggesting employees. She was creating an entire network inside my father's company. That was the moment I picked up my phone and called my father. "Dad," I said quietly, "you need to look at what I just found." There was silence on the other end. Because we both knew this could change everything. My father didn't say much after I explained everything. That was what scared me the most. My father was the kind of man who always had an answer. He built a company from nothing, survived difficult years, and handled every crisis with confidence. But that night, he sat across from me with the employee records in his hands, and for the first time in my life, I saw uncertainty on his face. "Emily," he finally said, "if this is true, we need to be absolutely certain before we make any decisions." I understood. This wasn't just about anger or betrayal. This was about people's careers, the company's future, and my father's reputation. So we started investigating. Because of my years around the company, I knew where to look. We reviewed hiring records, internal emails, department changes, and financial reports. And the more we uncovered, the worse it became. The 27 employees were not hired randomly. They had been placed carefully. One person was moved into finance. Another was given control over hiring. Someone else was placed in operations. Slowly, Victoria's influence spread into every important area of the company. Each individual decision looked harmless. But together, they created something much bigger. A network. A system where Victoria's opinions carried more weight than my father's. Then we discovered something even more disturbing. Several longtime employees who disagreed with Victoria's decisions had suddenly resigned or been pushed into less important positions. People who had spent years helping my father build the company were being replaced by people loyal to her. That was when my father realized this wasn't about improving the business. It was about control. But the biggest shock came when we found messages between Daniel and his mother. He knew. Maybe he didn't know every detail, but he knew enough. He knew she was placing people inside the company. He knew she was gaining influence. And instead of warning us, he protected her. I remember staring at those messages and feeling something inside me break. The divorce had already hurt. But realizing my husband had stood beside the people working against my family was a different kind of pain. My father closed the laptop and looked at me. "Emily, we have to act carefully. We can't let emotions control this." He was right. So we prepared everything. Every document. Every record. Every piece of evidence. Because the next step would decide whether Victoria's plan succeeded or finally collapsed. The next morning, my father made a decision that I knew would change everything. He called an emergency leadership meeting. Not a family meeting. Not an emotional confrontation. A business meeting. Because that was the difference between my father and Victoria. She used relationships and loyalty to gain power. My father built his company on accountability and trust. Every department head was asked to attend. The records were prepared. The evidence was organized. Nothing was based on rumors or personal feelings. Only facts. When the meeting started, my father stood at the front of the room where he had announced hundreds of important decisions throughout the years. He looked at the people sitting there and calmly said, "Today, we are reviewing several internal decisions that may have affected this company's future." The room became silent. One by one, the connections were revealed. The unusual hiring patterns. The conflicts of interest. The sudden changes in leadership positions. The removal of experienced employees. People who had ignored the warning signs finally started seeing the bigger picture. By the end of the meeting, several employees were placed under review. After a proper investigation, those who had violated company policies were removed from their positions. The company wasn't destroyed. It was protected. But Victoria didn't accept that. That evening, she came to my house. She didn't knock politely. She walked in angry. "You ruined everything," she said. I looked at her and almost couldn't believe what I was hearing. "You're blaming me. You turned my son against me. You attacked my reputation. You destroyed everything I worked for." I took a breath and calmly replied, "No, Victoria. I exposed what you were doing." She shook her head. "You don't understand. I was helping this company." I looked directly at her. Helping means supporting someone's success. It doesn't mean secretly building your own control inside their business. For the first time, she had nothing to say. Then Daniel appeared behind her. And I could see it on his face. He finally understood that protecting his mother had cost him everything. The marriage was gone. The trust was gone. And the plan they had built together was finally falling apart. For a long time, I thought my divorce was the moment my life fell apart. I thought losing my husband meant losing my future. I thought watching my marriage end was the biggest failure I would ever experience. But months later, I realized something important. My divorce wasn't the end of my story. It was the moment I finally saw the truth. After everything was exposed, my father worked hard to rebuild trust inside the company. The employees who had stayed loyal finally felt heard. The people who had been pushed aside were given opportunities again. The company survived. Actually, it became stronger. And Victoria? She lost the influence she had spent years trying to create. She couldn't control the company anymore. She couldn't manipulate the people around her anymore. The carefully planned future she wanted disappeared because the foundation of it was built on deception. As for Daniel, I never got the apology I hoped for. Maybe part of me wanted him to understand the damage he caused. But eventually, I learned that closure doesn't always come from someone else admitting they were wrong. Sometimes, closure comes from accepting that you deserve better. I started rebuilding my own life. I focused on my career. I spent more time with my father. I surrounded myself with people who valued honesty and respect. Looking back now, I realize I was holding on to a marriage that had already stopped protecting me. The day I signed those divorce papers, I thought I was losing everything. But I was actually getting my freedom back. Because sometimes the people who walk away from your life are the same people who were preventing you from finding your own.